To God be the glory, great things he has done. So loved him the world that he gave us his son, who yielded his life and atonement for sin, and opened the life gate that all may go in.
Thanks for tuning in to No Trash, Just Truth, a podcast of Proverbs 910 Ministries.
With your hosts, Chris Paxson and Rose Spiller. Be sure to check out our other podcast, 5 a.m. Theology, available on all platforms.
And give him the glory, great things he has done.
Welcome back. In several of our recent episodes, we've been mentioning Charlie Kirk's death and everything that's been happening since then, since it definitely seems to have started some sort of movement. For the last several years, at least, we've been living in what's been termed the negative world. And that's a term coined by Aaron Renn, who's the author of a book called Life in the Negative World. And when he says negative world, it means a world where Christianity has been viewed more and more negatively. And that's been happening here in America and probably throughout the world. If the death of Charlie Kirk has done anything, one of those things is it has shown that we might not have been in the negative world as much as we might have been thinking that we were. Christianity has not been squashed to the nth degree. In fact, it seems to be alive and well. Charlie Kirk's death showed that Christianity is thriving, despite the evil that has shown its ugly head in the last decade and even before.
Yeah, and his memorial service was proof of that. And the outpouring, the people who got bold. I think we said a couple weeks ago, even J.D. Vance said he feels emboldened to speak about Jesus when he never did before. You know, at Charlie Kirk's memorial, Chris, as we know, the gospel was shared over and over again. And if you didn't see it, you should watch it. His death even had effects on other parts of the world. So the question is, now what? How do people move forward in their countries if what Charlie Kirk had to say moved them in a more biblical or at least a more conservative direction? What if there's a lot of people around the world who want the nations they live in to be a place for its citizens to live at peace and even flourish? I mean, we certainly want that here in the United States. What's the proper way for Christians to move forward now? How do we, as the big C church, meaning the invisible church, engage the culture in a way that's meaningful? How should we approach the political arena? You know, there are several things that are being heralded as the right way. And we've seen this before, but which way is really good? And which way maybe isn't so good? And that's what we want to talk about today.
If you've been on social media in the last few weeks, you might have seen two of those ways presented to move forward, juxtaposed against one another, and that's been termed as Kellerism versus Kirkism. If you've been in almost any Reformed denomination in the last 30 years, you've likely heard of the late pastor Tim Keller. If you were an evangelical in America during the 2000s, Tim Keller was a name that you likely knew. In the late 1980s, he planted a church in New York City called Redeemer Presbyterian Church. And Redeemer eventually drew something like 5,000 people on Sundays. And they launched a church planting network that has led to over 800 churches throughout cities in the world.
Tim Keller wrote some really good books. He wrote one that I really like called The Reason for God. He wrote Prodigal God, which Chris, you and I taught on once.
Yep.
And he wrote several others. Tim Keller's approach to evangelism was that we're to be winsome. And as you can imagine, that approach to evangelism flavored his approach to politics and how Christians should engage in it. His views on engaging the culture was that the gospel is unavoidably offensive, but when we share it, we must make sure that we're not offensive in addition. And he explained how Christianity is not tied to any particular culture or political party. And that might have had a slight bit of truth back in the 90s, Chris, and maybe even the early 2000s. when we lived in what some termed a neutral world, a time when Christianity was neither broadly supported or heavily opposed by the culture. It just was. If you were a Christian, fine. If you weren't, fine.
Over the last 10 years or so, Tim Keller, along with some others, namely Russell Moore, David French, Ed Stetzer, Rick Warren, and Francis Collins, and maybe a few others, started promoting the idea that Christianity is neither left nor right. That's their words. And started promoting a third way for Christians to approach politics that would avoid any partisanship. That's when Matthew 22:39's command to love your neighbor as yourself became their call to the Christian community to be pro-abortion, pro-LGBTQ and everything that goes with it, pro-open border, pro-gender transition, pro-vaccination, and pro-masking during COVID. That's something that we've covered in other episodes. And pro just about anything that was on the leftist agenda.
Yeah, they even were pro-gender pronoun.
Yes.
Francis Collins is a self-proclaimed ally and advocate of the LGBTQ movement. David French has referred to a drag queen story hour as a blessing of liberty. Now, he's a never Trumper who endorsed Kamala Harris in the 2024 election. Russell Moore has argued for amnesty for illegal immigrants in our country, saying that doing so is being pro-life, which is ironic since they're also pro-abortion.
Yep.
And we could go on. Now, if you're in the PCA, which is the Presbyterian Church in America, a reformed denomination, all of this should get your attention because not only was Tim Keller the darling of the denomination and very influential, as we see the effects in the PCA, just last summer in 2024, the PCA scheduled David French to speak at their annual General Assembly. Now, thankfully, there was enough of an uproar that they canceled him.
Yeah, thankfully. Tim Keller's ideas on social issues and politics were sometimes unbiblical. And while I won't say that he was a socialist, he did have those type of mentors from way back in his college days, and some of his writings leaned that way. In one reference in his book, Generous Justice, he references the Old Testament civil law, and he says this about it. Israel redistributed money, assets, and even land from the well-off to the poor with the help of state-sponsored laws and institutions. Now, that was a theocracy. The Israelites were God's chosen people, and they were a theocracy. And here he is promoting that we should order our national politics today according to the theocracy established under the old covenant that God made with ancient Israel. Rose, that's not even using the Bible correctly.
No.
Doing what Tim Keller's suggesting has a flip side to it. And it's a flip side that the liberals are scared to death about. And we're going to get to that in a little bit.
Yeah. Keller's third way initiatives paved the way to what's more left-leaning groups. One group in particular is called the After Party, and that's a curriculum developed by Russell Moore, David French, and Curtis Chang, and it's meant to change how a Christian thinks about their political leanings. And here's a quote from their website. Christians have lost their way when it comes to the intersection of faith and politics. It's time to reframe our political identity as we take the lead in healing what's broken. Jesus' call is clear. We're to be salt and light in the world. Come be equipped and encouraged as we prepare for the true party to come. We've saved a seat for you. Now, Chris, I will admit, I see the word intersection in anything and I'm ready to check out.
Me too. As soon as I see it, I'm done, man. I've already judged the whole thing and I'm done.
Yeah, and you know what?
Nothing to do
Most of the time you're judging correctly. So.
Yes, I know, and so are you. Here's another quote from the After Party's website, and this is in regards to Charlie Kirk's view of family life and how it should be biblically. And this is what they say about it. Charlie Kirk's valorization of the 1953 consensus was great for Turning Point USA, the MAGA movement, the Republican Party, and evangelical Christianity. But it constituted a one-way ticket to civil war. It didn't work. It couldn't work. We couldn't get from there to here even if we wanted to. And we shouldn't want to. And that's the end of their quote. Now, they're just slamming the traditional family values and biblical patriarchy.
Yeah, and if you've studied the roots of liberalism and progressivism and critical race theory and all that stuff, their one goal was to destroy the nuclear family and patriarchy. That was the goal of feminism. That was the goal of all the things that have destroyed society. Destroy the nuclear family, and you can control people a lot better.
Yeah, and that's exactly what these people want. And Rose, one of the things that makes me so sick about this whole Keller movement is I see so many people that you and I used to go to church with, and they follow this stuff. And they just can't see what's underlying all the things they think are so great about it.
And ignore that George Soros was a contributor to the Gospel Coalition.
Yeah.
A staunch atheist is giving money to a Christian organization. Why do you think that is? I should say an influential Christian organization.
Right.
And by the way, if you didn't know, Tim Keller started the Gospel Coalition. He was one of the founders.
Yeah, and I'll say, like, there's a few people in there I really like Kevin DeYoung. I think he's solid. But I know.
I read his stuff and think, why are you still there?
Yeah, I don't know why he is. I don't know if he's trying to change it from the inside out. But yeah, as a whole organization as a whole, it's funded badly and has some underlying bad stuff.
Yep. And I admit, other than Kevin DeYoung, I see the Gospel Coalition on anything. And again, I pretty much check out.
Yep.
The Kellerites want you to believe that the conservative Christians are at fault and are in error, but that's certainly not true. And it's not true that Christians don't have to be political. We do need to be political. We do need to speak out. We have to push against the moral decay in our society. Remember, evil flourishes when good men do nothing. And like it or not, although the political party on the right, the Republicans, don't get everything biblically right. I mean, let's face it, they get a lot wrong. But at least they're getting some things right. At least they're trying to keep morality in society. And the left isn't. I mean, let's be honest. Everything the left and the Democrat Party stands for is pretty much evil. You know, Dan Bongino used to say, the Republicans are not the solution to all your problems, but the Democrats are the cause of all your problems.
Yes.
And all that being said, Christians do need to engage in today's culture. And we've been saying that for weeks, and the Bible tells us that. But Chris, what's the best way to do that?
Well, we're going to go into another way that sounds good and has some really good talking points and probably has some good ideas, but it's not quite the right one. The last big slide in society's morality came in around the 1960s. Conservative Americans saw the decay of moral order, and it was in everything from sexual impurity to feminism and all kinds of other things, drug use, all kinds of stuff. It seemed to Christians, at least in America and maybe even the Christianized world, that everybody was turning their back on God. At that point, a new idea was introduced into Christian circles by a man named R.J. Rushdoony, who came up with what was called Christian Reconstructionism. He was proposing a whole reconstruction of society itself aligned with Christianity, hence the term Christian Reconstructionism. And it also goes by these names: theonomy, dominion theology, magisterial Protestantism, and Christian nationalism. Now, Orthodox Christianity has always recognized a threefold law: civil law, the moral law, and the ceremonial law. All the law has been fulfilled by Christ, and two of those threefold divisions of the law have expired: the civil, which is the one they're promoting, and the ceremonial. The moral law is rooted in God's character. It has always existed, and it will never end.
Yeah, this form of Reconstructionist Christian nationalism teaches, like you said, Chris, that the Old Covenant civil laws, unless it was specifically abolished in the New Testament, should be the universal standard of civil law for all people in the nation. So what he's saying is that the nations today should implement those Old Covenant laws along with the punishments outlined in the Mosaic Law. And it would be for all people of the nation, regardless if they identify as Christian or not.
Yeah. And so what would that look like? Well, in the Old Testament covenant civil law, God commanded the death penalty for several sins, and I'll just give you a few of the big list: idolatry, adultery, rape, kidnapping, blasphemy, breaking the Sabbath, and many other things. Like I said, Israel was to purge the evil from their midst, and that meant kill the people that violated those things. A Reconstructionist would call for those same Mosaic law punishments to be applied to many of the sins in that big long list, with the sword wielded by the civil magistrate, since civil laws of the nation would reflect God's law. I mean, that's what they're going for.
Right. And we would agree that some of those deserve death, but
yes.
I mean, you start saying idolatry deserves death, we got a problem.
Yeah, I know.
And understand here, they're not saying that Christians should have an influence on the nation's laws. It's not just saying try to elect politicians who are Christians or who will uphold Christian values, or even who will make laws that reflect God's moral laws. We would all be for that, and we should all, and we should all be for that.
Mm-hmm.
This version of Christian nationalism is similar to what's going on in the nation of Syria right now, who says they are a Muslim nation, and it's illegal to publicly say you're anything other than Muslim. In fact, the penalty is death for it.
Yep. That's what they're saying.
Exactly. Over 20,000 Christians have been killed in Syria because they identify as Christian. Now, most who hold to this Christian nationalism view believe that Christ will reign a literal 1,000 years over all the nations before his second coming.
Yeah, and they're not talking about bringing all the people in those nations to belief in the Lord for salvation and thus changing the nation's politics. They're not even talking about just bringing people from every tribe, tongue, and nation. They consider Christ reigning as long as the nation itself identifies itself as Christian and then subdues the society accordingly.
So the nations would be Christianized even if all the citizens aren't. And they're calling for nations to express Christianity as the national religion, enforcing God's civil law on the nation's people. And that's how they determine that Christ is ruling over the nation. It's not that everybody's Christian, but it's everybody's under God's civil law.
All politics are framed by somebody's morals. When we go to the voting booth, we have to ask, and we all do, by whose standard do I want my country run? There's a lot of talking points around this that sound good.
Theonomists have suggested that in this reconstructed society, non-Christians would not be allowed to vote or hold political office. Christians would control organizations. They would control everything from banking systems to civil government to education. The public square would be cleaned up, as they say. But there's definite problems with Christian nationalism of this Reconstructionist type. For one, Chris, how do you prove someone's actually a Christian? They could certainly claim to be.
Back
in 4th century Rome, Constantine made the Roman Empire Christian, and it was illegal not to be Christian. Non-Christians were not allowed to have businesses and stuff like that. And what happened? Well, it was beneficial to be a Christian. So a lot of corrupt people said, oh yeah, I'm a Christian. And the nation became really corrupt. The church became really corrupt.
It never turns out well. And Rose, there are biblical problems too. The civil law, particular to ancient Israel, ceased when the nation ceased. And lots of passages in Deuteronomy tell us that just by saying they were to be observed in the land, meaning the promised land. The civil law served a purpose for its time. According to Galatians, the law was given until the seed, meaning Jesus, had come. That's Galatians 3:19. And that Galatians passage goes on to say the law was our guardian until Christ came that we might be justified by faith. Now that this faith has come, we are no longer under our guardian. That's Galatians 3:24 and 25.
Yeah. One thing they're doing is they're not letting the Old Testament be interpreted by the New Testament. We criticize false teachers all the time for doing the opposite.
Yeah.
They don't let the Old Testament interpret the New Testament. Well, these guys are doing the opposite. And one example of the use of the civil law in the New Covenant is found in 1 Corinthians 5:13. There, Paul is telling the church in Corinth how to deal with a man who was caught in sexual sin with his stepmother. And he tells them, expel the wicked man from your midst. Now, in the Old Testament, they would have killed him. But Paul is saying, expel him from the fellowship of the church with the goal of bringing him to repentance and bringing him back into the fellowship. Chris, that's church discipline. That's not killing him.
No, it's not codifying the old law into new law. And, there are lots of verses in Hebrews that tell us about all the things that changes when Jesus comes. We have a new priesthood, and that changes the law, just all kinds of things. And Ephesians 2:14-15 says, Christ has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments and ordinances.
You're right, Chris. All of the law, all 613 laws were fulfilled by Christ. And two of the threefold divisions of the law, like we mentioned earlier, the civil and the ceremonial, have expired. Now, the third part of the law, the moral law, didn't expire and won't ever expire because it's rooted in the character of God. So out of the 613 laws that they were given in the Old Testament, only 12, the 10 Commandments and the 2 Great Commandments, transfer because they're a summary of God's moral law. And again, they're rooted in his character.
Yep, they're eternal.
That's right. And this moral law is said in Scripture to be written on the heart of every person. Paul even says that the Gentiles, who is referred to the ungodly, have it written on their hearts. And he says that in Romans 1 and 2.
This form of Christian nationalism, started by Rushdoony, it was championed by his son-in-law, Gary North, and Greg Bounson, and others. But today, you're going to hear people like Stephen Wolfe, who is the author of The Case for Christian Nationalism, and pastors like Joel Webbin, who seems pretty much fully on board with this idea, champion this. And there are many pastors that they just kind of are in a loosey-goosey place. They seem somewhat committed to the idea, yet not quite fully on board with it when you stick them with some of the, individual parts of it. And we only touched on the surface of that, but as we're talking about ways for the church to go forward, you need to know that this one's out there, has lots of good things that sound good to our ears sometimes, but not all of it's good.
No. And the third way, the better way, has recently gotten a new name. It's been called Kirkism now, after Charlie Kirk. And some people who align with this get labeled as Christian nationalists, but it's certainly not the same as the Reconstructionist Christian nationalists that we talked about. But what Kirkism, as it's called, for lack of a better word, is that we do use God's standards as our impetus for national law. Again, we try to elect Christian politicians. We try to push the government to instate moral laws. It's definitely not Kellerism. We're not being winsome. We're not compromising our position, watering down our theology to be more attractive to unbelievers. It's not seeker sensitive. Instead, it's pretty much doing what Charlie Kirk was known for doing, engaging the culture, not compromising our positions or hiding our beliefs, not being apologetic about our position. Instead, we speak truth into society unapologetically. We stand against this winsomeness. We denounce the 11th commandment, as Vodi Bakum says, thou shalt be nice. And instead, we stand on the moral high ground of Christian belief, and we don't ever apologize for it. We're not rude, we're not disrespectful, but we're not apologetic either. Tim Keller was right about one thing. The gospel is offensive. But what he was wrong about was that we should try to make it winsome for people. Charlie Kirk, on the other hand, stood before people and told them the truth, the absolute truth, the scientific truth. all about the gender stuff and everything. The truth about all the lies that have been told to 2 or 3 generations now. When we stop apologizing for truth, people start listening. When they realize we are firm in our stance and we are confident in what we believe, they're much more likely to listen than when we're, well, no, we don't believe everything is bad. And no, some people are good. And yeah, God loves everyone. You know what? Who wants to listen to that garble?
Nobody. And they don't. And we've seen that over the last several decades. Jamie Bambrick, who is pastor and creator of Clear Truth Media, says this about Kellerism versus Kirkism. Keller says that conservative Christianity gives those considering the Christian faith the strong impression that to be converted, they need not only believe in Jesus, but also need to become members of the fill in the blank party. Kirk comes along and goes, yeah, pretty much actually right. I mean, I'm not saying you have to be going to the Republican Party, right? But being a Democrat and voting for that is morally wrong, and it's a failure in your discipleship. If you're voting for politics that make Planned Parenthood throw a party and warmly endorse you, then you're not following Jesus correctly, and you're living in a way that's destructive to yourself and others. I'm going to explain that to you and call you to turn from that. And I think this guy's right. That's basically what Charlie Kirk did.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, I just saw a solid Reformed pastor, can't remember who it was, but he said, if you come to me and say your politics are far right and you're a Christian, I wouldn't question it. But if you came to me and said your politics are far left and you're a Christian, I would have serious doubt that you could possibly be a Christian. Kellerism made the church go silent on controversial subjects. Remember, the whole goal was to be winsome. Charlie Kirk's way makes the church re-engage with culture. It makes them take a stand. Kellerism's influence led to the debauchery and immorality that we've seen in the political arena and around the world for decades, even in the church. It's no wonder that given that extremism, that people are going to the other extreme and touting something as dramatic as Christian Reconstructionism. We want our lives to reflect biblical standards, without a doubt. In fact, if you live in America, America was founded on God's moral laws. So we all want our country to look like that. But changing the Constitution, the thing which is our highest authority here in America, to match the Old Covenant civil laws isn't the way to go. Like we said, it's based on the moral law, but not the civil law. Having the state mixed up in the church's business has never worked out well, like we saw when we talked about Rome in the 4th century, and over again, whenever the church is in China, where the state is involved in religion, in Nazi Germany, where the state took over religion, never works out.
Never works out. The way to go is Charlie Kirk. It's Kirkism. Charlie Kirk's faith influenced his politics, and his brand of politics influenced the political sphere to the point where politician after politician gave a clear gospel presentation for the world to hear. He was a brilliant man who knew how to engage the culture on many topics, and that's clearly the way the church needs to go today.
And he certainly wasn't the first or the only person to do that.
No.
We've recently lost Vodi Bakum, a dear saint who was brilliant in doing the same thing. So Charlie Kirk wasn't the first or the only person doing it, but he did bring this form of evangelism to light.
Yep.
And it's a good thing. And that's where we'll end today. Have a blessed day, everyone.
And give him